Greatness. That is a word that is criminally overused these days to describe phenomenon that are moderate to good. Any form of media that is even remotely decent it can be considered great these days by somebody. And that's a tragedy because very few things are truly great. Alright, before you run to the comments section and type out things like, you can't say that, art is subjective, you can't decide what's nice for someone else, they need to decide for themselves, who are you to say that one thing is great and one thing is bad, blah blah blah. I get it. And yes, at its core, art obviously is completely subjective. That's what makes art beautiful, is the fact that I can look at something and be amazed by it. A painting, a book, a video game, I can look at it and love it, and you can look at the exact same thing and hear it the same way or whatever, and absolutely not resonate with it at all. That's okay. That's what makes art beautiful, is its subjectivity. So that's not lost on me. However, some art forms are able to transcend the subjectivity into something greater. I believe there's certain forms of art, whether it's a book, movie, whatever, that people can kind of collectively agree is objectively great, even if they don't personally resonate with that form of art, to a personal level. Some forms of art rise above subjectivity and enter a different plane of existence. That sounds very dramatic, of course, but it's true. And I believe the clearest example of this, above all else, any form of media you can think of, is, of course, the Star Wars sequel trilogy. No, I'm just kidding. Obviously, I hope you click off if you thought I was serious, but no, in this instance, I'm talking about Pink Floyd, which I consider to be the greatest band of all time, and we'll get into why. So before we get too deep into it, I will say this is not like a technical analysis of their music, nor is it a deep dive of the history of the band or anything like that. Today, mostly, I will be focusing on kind of the philosophy or what I consider to be the DNA of the band, and how that DNA transferred or was utilized to create the timeless music that we know today. Music that I consider, or that I would say, has transcended the musicians who created it, has transcended generations of people on this earth, and music that is far more relevant today than it ever was, during the time it was created. So, one more quick disclaimer before my spiel. When I say Pink Floyd, I'm speaking of everything pre 1981, 1982 Pink Floyd. So that includes, everything up to The Wall, including The Wall. The reason for this is because after The Wall, a clash of egos between the two engines of the band, David Gilmour and Roger Waters, ended in them essentially breaking up. The name Pink Floyd continued on, obviously. It was too big to just, retire. But anything after The Wall was David Gilmour and Friends. So that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the core of Pink Floyd. So with that out of the way, one of the main reasons why Pink Floyd is the greatest band of all time was their devotion to the album as an experience. What do I mean by this? Most artists create songs and music that is digestible. Most artists create songs that are roughly 3 to 5 minutes. They can fit on a radio station. They can get replayed very frequently, blah, blah, blah. And there's nothing wrong. I'm not criticizing artists for just, you're just creating a song just to go on the radio. I understand it. You want as many people to experience your art as possible. There's nothing wrong with that on the surface. However, a potential downside of this is your album starts to sound like a collection of individual songs and not one unifying body. It's a collection of cells versus an entire organism. What I love about Pink Floyd is that if it's your first time listening to an album, you don't really know when a song ends and a new one begins because you're just listening to this one unifying experience. It's so seamless with the transitions between songs. A lot of the time you just don't even catch it. And that's the way they intended it. That's by design. But this philosophy leads to two key advantages. The first one, like I just talked about, is the entire album feeling like its own experience, its own unique experience. And the second one is it allows Pink Floyd to flex their creative muscles. They don't have to be beholden to a certain set amount of time. You don't have to shrink a verse, cut the ending, whatever, so that you can fit it into this little 5-minute format. You can just make music and go. And the only constraint you have is your imagination. In this scenario, this is what Pink Floyd was dealing with. Their only constraints were their imagination because they weren't focused on short forming their own content. And I already know the counter to this of there's plenty of memes I've already seen of, people making fun of Pink Floyd songs for, being too long or they take too long to get into. And that's fair, I mean, not everyone wants to listen to a 20-minute song when they get in their car. I get it, but you have to give something to get something is the way I look at it. Nothing really worthwhile is going to require nothing from you. And this includes our own entertainment. Reading a really good book requires you to concentrate on the book and actually understand what's going on. Watching a good movie requires your full attention. The problem we have today is that short form content, the form, TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, has hijacked our brains. The algorithms taking advantage of our psychology and our nature to essentially rob us of anything meaningful. And now we're all conditioned to believe that if it's not quick and easy and instant gratification, then there's something wrong with it. And it's pretty tragic. It's a tragic reality of today. But once you realize it, it's much easier to kind of overcome it, I think. Little off track there, but those will certainly be topics that are discussed in future videos. But for now, we're sticking to Pink Floyd. Roger Waters and David Gilmour were able to create masterpiece after masterpiece because they weren't constrained by anything. And their artistic vision, was uncompromised completely. They didn't care how long a song was. They didn't care if it was catchy or not. They wanted to fit their music within the greater shape and greater form of their albums and create these experiences that we know today. Quick side note before I move to my next main point. Something that annoys me is a lot of people don't put Pink Floyd in the same top tier of classic rock, bands, the same tier as the Beatles, maybe Led Zeppelin, the Stones. They don't put them in the same tier as them simply because of their lack of radio hits, relative to these other bands. I think off the top of my head, I can think of Another Brick in the Wall, Part 2, and Money as like their two main radio hits. But let me be perfectly clear. The reason they didn't have the same quantity of hits as these other bands is because that was never their focus. I'm not saying these other bands went out of their way to make radio hits. They were obviously very talented musicians, all of them. But they, in a way, they did cater their music a little bit to a radio audience. Most of Pink Floyd's best work comes in these long form songs that just slowly build and, it's a slow burn. And this music is just incompatible with radio. You couldn't edit down the songs far enough to actually fit the requirements of radio without butchering them completely. And thus they were never exposed to the radio. Most of their true talent shines through in this kind of music, and that's what makes them special. I think is that they, despite knowing the downsides of doing that, they still just plugged right along and said, we're making our sounds. So main point number 2 as to what made them great, in my opinion, is something that I call the 80% rule. I'm not sure if this is a thing or not. It's something I came up with on my own. But essentially what the 80% rule is that any one individual, I believe, is capable of accessing their own talent or creativity or, potential up to 80% at any given time on their own. So for most people, this 80% is more than enough. But in my opinion, if you want to access your full potential in any creative endeavor, you need somebody else to bring it out of you, or to help bring it out of you through collaboration, through disagreeing. So with Roger Waters, he was the obviously he wrote all the lyrics for Pink Floyd's main works. He was the lyrical genius of Pink Floyd. David Gilmour's talent came in his musical brilliance. So his guitar work, the structural arrangements of like the guitar solos and whatnot, that was his strength. Together, or I guess on their own, extremely talented musicians. They would have been just fine and successful on their own, but together, the combination of them together is what produced the greatness that I'm talking about today. The greatness of Pink Floyd. What's funny is they hated each other's guts. They were constantly arguing with each other, constantly disagreeing about the vision, constantly bickering about this point or that point. And I'm sure to themselves individually at points, they probably thought, I'm the talent of this band. I'm the reason we're so successful. I you know So and so is writing my coattails. I'm the one carrying this whole project. And in reality, it was their collaboration. It was the act of disagreeing. It was the act of argument. That's what produced that extra 100, that full 100% from either one. Was just the back and forth, the collaboration. I mean, if you don't believe me, simply just look at what they did on their own after the breakup. I think Roger Waters had a couple solo albums. I've listened to him. There's a couple decent songs on there, but for the most part, it's just pretty meh. Nothing very exciting. And just look at the official Pink Floyd music post The Wall 1980, which, as I mentioned before, was just David Gilmour and friends. But again, a few good songs on them here and there, and obviously some really good guitar riffs because that was what David Gilmour specialized in. But for the most part, I think that music was pretty mid. I don't think it stands out. It's not really that exciting. And it's not because these guys lost their talent all of a sudden. They just magically stop being able to create such top tier music. It's because the process was destroyed. It's because their collaboration factor was gone because they obviously weren't making music together anymore. The 80% rule. I think together they were 100%. On their own, they were at best, 80%. And you see the result. Obviously, they kind of both fell off after their breakup. So yeah, major point one I'd say was their focus on the entire album experience and not just individual song making. Point two, I'd say the 80% rule in terms of their collaboration factor, how that was able to extract the best from both people, the best of their talents. The third and final point I'll talk about today was just their focus on the messaging and the themes of their music. Earlier I said I think their music has transcended generations, that it's more relevant now today more than ever. The reason I say this is because of what they are able to communicate in their songs. I guess you could argue that this is more of a point towards Roger Waters because he was the main lyricist, as I mentioned. But all of their themes within these songs are directly targeted at dissecting and explaining the human experience and different aspects of that. And that's a really unique. I mean, actually, I shouldn't say it's a really unique thing. Plenty of artists do that, but the amount of depth that they're able to go in with some of their music is pretty phenomenal. Just to rattle a couple off the top of my head, Us and Them from Dark Side talks about conflict and the kind of territorial nature of people to kind of categorize ourselves into teams. Dogs from Animals is one of my other favorites, talking about greed and how destructive that can be. So there's plenty of examples I can go. Maybe I'll list a couple in the description. But my point is that there is something substantive in every single one of their songs. They choose to go out of their way to commentate on some aspect of human nature. And that's why it's so relevant today. It's because that will never go out of style. That'll never stop being relevant. People are people. And I guess as I get towards the end of this video, I'm sure there's going to be some people in the comments saying like, oh, you only mentioned Roger Waters and David Gilmour. Like, there were other members, they contributed. And yeah, sure, I don't just want to discredit them, but I'm talking about the powertrain here. I'm talking about the engine and the transmission. I'm not talking about the windshield wipers or the headlights or the carburetor or the radiator. I'm sure those things help, obviously. They're important to a car functioning. but we're talking about the engine here. You know, we're talking about what actually drove them forward. So no offense to the other members. Can't even remember their names off the top of my head. I'm sure they were important, but yeah, I'm sure I'll get some flack for that in the comments. But that's just how I feel. I mean, the band was Roger Waters and David Gilmour. That's what it was. You can't have Grateful Dead without Jerry. You know, that's as simple as that. So yeah, Pink Floyd is the greatest band of all time. If you disagree with that, that's fine. You have to at least put them in the top 3 to 5. If I didn't do enough in this video to convince you otherwise, that's my fault. You should just go listen to them, and hopefully that'll be enough. But yeah, I do realize these videos are kind of just me blabbing, and I need to get better about kind of being more tactful and precise and efficient with what I'm saying. But just go listen to them. It's simple as that. Listen, mainly I'd say listen to their 1970s albums. So that includes Metal, Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, and The Wall. I'd say stick to those albums, but listen to them. They're fantastic. They're all-time classics. At the very least, you will listen to some decent music that you can say you've heard, so that you don't sound dumb if someone asks you. But yeah, anyway, hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you learned a little something, and hope that you this convinced anyone who hasn't listened to them to at least check them out. And I wonder if some Pink Floyd fans will agree with what I said or disagree. Leave your comments down below. Anyway, take care and have a good one. Nova out.